All right, we're going to start in 1 minute, so prepare yourself. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harry Furman. I am a co-chair of the South Jersey Holocaust Coalition, and thank you all for coming today for another of the workshops presented by the Coalition. What we have today is a presentation that will be live in front of you, and also we'll have people online who are going to be watching us while we do what we're going to be doing. So it's a combination, call that a hybrid, call it what you will, but that's what we'll be doing. So this particular workshop was originally going to be several weeks ago, and it was postponed because of the unfortunate and unexpected death of one of our colleagues who is a member of the coalition, whose name was Sam Levy. It was very much a shock when it happened, and very much a surprise, obviously, that it occurred. And we had seen him literally online a short time before this happened at a meeting that we had. So before we start today, if you would all just take a moment for reflection before we start, just a moment. So you do whatever you want to do, bow your heads, not bow your heads, but just take a moment of silence. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm sure that Sam would have wanted us, because he's a great believer in the work that we've been doing over these many years, that we come back to this, and today's workshop is really a pretty profound subject. We do a lot of different things in Coalition that deal with issues related to Holocaust and genocide and associated issues of conscience and responsibility. We've been doing this for many years, and this is no exception. So if you look behind me, you see that there is the first slide of what will be two PowerPoints that you will be looking at today. And this is how we're going to do this. It's now, we gave ourselves a little additional time because we didn't know who was going to show up and the logistics of coming onto the campus. But I'm going to continue till about approximately 10 after 5, no later than a quarter after 5. At that time, my colleague and your teacher, Tony Iaconelli, will also then come in, and he's going to have his own presentation that will continue until approximately 5:45. I see we have some more people coming. And at 5:45, we're going to take a moment for light refreshments for approximately an hour, a half an hour, and then about 6:15, we'll come back, and for about 45 minutes, Tony and I will complete what we're going to do, including engage in some interaction between ourselves and you. Now, I want you to be aware of this in terms of my approach. I am not going to stand behind that dais. I never do. In all my years of teaching, I never did. That goes back, 50 years. So it's not going to be that way today. So we're going to begin a presentation, and at some point I'm going to come back to you and hopefully engage with you. We have some disadvantage because in order to engage with you, we only got one microphone, and I'm going to have to hand it to somebody, which is not the most convenient way to do this. But we're going to try. Unless you have what I hope would be the case, which is a powerful voice that you'll be able to be heard, maybe even online. Is that possible if they have a loud enough voice? Could be. That means you have a challenge if you want to try that. So the presentation today, as you can see from behind me, is the subject which is often not discussed very much, as sensitive as it is, and yet is in the back of many people's minds. And the subject, as you can see, is faith and God in the shadow of the Holocaust. So if I could have the next slide. Okay, I can click too. I can do that. Back. Yeah. Okay. So we begin. This one right. Back. Back. One more. That's it. So my first slide for you is a reality. You all should know that the war ended in 1945, and the Holocaust occurred in those war years and before those war years. And after the war ended, there was some assessment of what had occurred during those years. And yet I note in the first slide the following reality. In the wake of the mass murder and destruction of the Second World War, the 1950s was the height of religious affiliation in the United States. Go back and look at that. Go back and look at the 1950s. And in the United States, there was tremendous religious affiliation, regular church attendance, high degree of religiosity that existed in the United States. This is a mere number of years after a bloody, murderous world war. Which should lead you to think about, is there any correlation between this high degree of affiliation that existed in the 1950s and what had occurred before? And then I make this comment, which we may come back to later, which is, although there is a difference between religion and faith, that may shock some of you, it can be said that this was a time that Americans looked to their faith for understanding the complex and sometimes brutal world revealed in its recent history. A personal comment. In the 1950s, I was a young boy. There was a time, guys, where I was a young boy. Hard to believe now, but I was. And I don't remember this, but I know this, that when I was 3 years old, a song was released that became very popular in the United States. In fact, I think it hit number 1 on the charts in 1953. It's not hip-hop. It was a very simple song, and it was sung by a guy named Frankie Lane, which some people here in this audience may know or remember as a name, and the song was called I Believe. And that's where I'm going to begin today. You may be surprised by that. And the next slide starts the first stanza of I Believe. And the stanza says, I believe for every drop of rain that falls, a flower grows. I believe that somewhere in the darkest night, a candle glows. I believe for everyone who goes astray, someone will come to show the way. I believe, I believe. And then there's a second stanza which I want to focus on. And the second stanza is, I believe above the storm, the smallest prayer will still be heard. I believe that someone in the great somewhere hears every word. Every time I hear a newborn cry, or touch a leaf, or see the sky, then I know why I believe. That song struck a very strong chord in the early 1950s. It may or may not strike a chord with you, and I'm curious for you young men in the corner here, how many of you have ever heard or seen those lyrics before? Could you raise your hands? Everybody notice? The answer is 0. So and that, by the way, as that's true of all the classes I teach, is great. Because you're going to walk away today knowing, yeah, there was some song in 1953 called I Believe, and I may even go home and listen to it. And think about what that suggests about this early period of the 1950s. Next line. As we start, I want everybody to understand this. I'm not a rabbi. I've not been trained in a seminary. I did go to Jewish day school for all of 1 year, and I got out of there really fast because my parents had an epiphany and realized that my education was going to be really stunted if I did. There's a whole story to that, but it's not worth it here. But I learned very early, I was 4 years old and being sent to somebody to teach me Hebrew. I'm a regular person who, when I heard this song again as a young man in the early 1970s, and I did, I raised an eyebrow and I quietly wondered. I didn't wonder before, but now I wondered. And here's just a little biography. I was a child of two parents who were refugees from the war. My father was a man now in his late 30s who had lost his entire family and been in Auschwitz, and a mom in her late 20s who had lost most of her family other than a sister and an uncle, and who had spent the war in a labor camp in the Carpathian Mountains. Next, as a young man, I read a small book by another survivor of Auschwitz, whose name was Elie Wiesel. As a matter of fact, I have this rarely seen copy of the book Night, which you look inside, is got all sorts of my lines in it and marks and all sorts of things. And it says inside, because I picked this up when I read it, 1960. That's how old this book is. And I read this book in the early 1970s. And now I know this book that I read 50 plus years ago, we now know that it's one of the most used books in courses in Holocaust education in the United States. What's often missed when you discuss this book, and I'm going to be curious to know whether you've discussed this book or how you feel about this book, is that often the passages that go to the theme in this workshop are not talked about. And that is the subject of the first part of my talk with you. Because I can read those portions of Elie Wiesel's Night and ask these two questions in response to Frankie Lane. Is the smallest prayer heard? Does someone in the great somewhere hear every word? And that's where we begin. Next slide. And the next slide. Just another comment as we start. Another survivor, a Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal, who made this comment at one point about this subject. He said, God must have been on leave during the Holocaust. Next slide. At one point in the book, and I'm going to come to you now, there's a character whose name is Akiba Drummer. And he says the following in Night. He says, folks, God is testing us. He wants to find out whether we can dominate our base instincts and kill the Satan within us. We have no right to despair. And if he punishes us relentlessly, it's a sign that, take out the why, he loves us all the more. That's from Night. That's a passage in Night. Those of you who have read this book, and let me ask it this way. How many of you in this group right here, and those of you online, you can raise your hands too, how many have read by 2022 Elie Wiesel's Night? Actually, most of you have not. Maybe after today, you go read it. Maybe that's another point. I notice over here, this group here, maybe it's time to read it. And so that's okay. So now I'm going to come to anybody, and I'm going to ask this question. What do you think of this comment by Akiba Drummer? What do you make of it? Anybody want to start? Don't make me stand here with this. Anyone? Comment? Young people? Not so young people? Anybody? Yes. Wait a minute. So I want you to get picked. Unfortunately, this is the disadvantage that we have.
It almost sounds like from the book of Job. Yeah, and because everything that happened to him, I mean, he lost everything, and people, were murdering and taking all his property. He was sick, and I mean, he just suffered. So I don't know if
Is this view of God an accusatory God, a point of view that God has reasons for what he's doing? What's the position taken here by Akiba Drummer? Don't let me intimidate you. Anybody want to comment? You guys here are smart guys. I know you are. All right, tell me what you think. Anyone?
Obeying his commandments and following his laws. And therefore, he was punishing them.
Okay. And Henry, if that's the case, if that's what Akiba Drummer is saying, what do you think of that?
It's I have a hard time grasping that, because God is supposed to be forgiving, God is supposed to be merciful, and why would he do this to his children?
You don't have to answer your own question now, but maybe by the end of this session, I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Are you ready? Anyone else want to comment? I'm going to come over to you so everybody can hear, those folks online can hear you. Go ahead.
I don't think that God is a punishing God.
Okay. You're responding to Akiba Drummer?
Yes. So I disagree, because I do not think that God is a punishing God.
So God is not testing them.
No.
He's not doing something to test their base instincts.
No.
Okay. I'll come back to you later as to what he is. Anybody else? Come on, guys. Don't you dare sit there on your hands. Anybody else? I'm going to come over. Go ahead.
I also disagree that that he loves us all the more he punishes us. I don't think anybody would have deserved that punishment, no matter what they did.
Why do you think Akiba Drummer is making this comment? He's in Auschwitz. Why is Akiba Drummer saying this? What is he doing by saying this? I'm coming over.
I think he's trying to get people to survive, that he's giving them a reason to push through, and that if you have that strong faith, you know that there is evil, and that if you push through it, if you can keep going on and have that faith.
Is Akiba Drummer telling his colleagues that they should maintain their faith?
Yes.
You want to say something? Come on over.
He may have been saying that as a way for himself to survive and just to get himself through what they were going through.
Trying to explain?
Yeah, and just trying to keep himself going every day, believing that God was testing them. Just a way to keep going himself.
Is there anybody in this room who sees some plausibility in the notion that God was testing these people? Nice and loud.
I personally think so. Like, he would, the Jewish people want to, like, God wants to test the Jewish people, his people throughout history, and wants to see if they can keep their faith in him.
So this was a trial. Don't take my words. You're allowed to say no. It's okay. You've done fine. Anything else?
No.
You did well. Anyone else want to comment here? Anyone else want to say something? I'm coming over here. Now, this is just one passage, only one in night. Only one. Yes.
First, I want to ask, is Drummond Jewish?
Akiba drummer?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
Akiba?
yes.
For sure.
And I don't think that he really believes in his people, because why would he want to see them punished relentlessly? Why is he feeling that that's what God would want for his people?
Anyone else? Coming back over here.
I think he says that because he's trying to find an excuse for himself to continue to believe.
A reason to believe. A reason to believe with all that's going on around him. Okay? Let's move to the next passage. Wiesel describes a hanging of 3 prisoners in the assembly place. The 3 mounted together onto the chairs. The 3 necks were placed in the same moment within the nooses. One of the 2, actually two adults, cry, "Long live liberty." But the child, and one of the 3 was a child who was being hung, was silent. "Where is God? Where is he?" someone behind me asked. The child hangs slowly. I took some of it out of the passage. His tongue was still red. His eyes were not glazed. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" And I heard a voice inside me answer him. "Where is he? Here he is. He's hanging here on this gallows." Again, Wiesel is making a comment about a young boy who is being hung at Auschwitz in the assembly place. A child. A child, I would guess, no older than any of you. And then his remark is, internally, is, you know where God is? He's right up there on the gallows. He's right up there. And notice the word he in that passage. What do you notice about the passage? It's not an accident. Where is he? What is it about the word he that you see? It's capitalized as he, as in, yeah, he. The he. My question to you again is, what do you think of what Wiesel is saying here? You want to know where God is? He's up there. What do you make of that? Anybody? First of all, what's your first reaction to that comment? By the way, there's nobody more well known in Holocaust literature than Elie Wiesel. No one. This book, by the way, was not the slim book when it first started. If you read about the history of how this book got created in France with Francois Mauriac, it was way longer than this. It had to be pared down. He was writing and writing and writing and writing. This is a comment about God. And those of you, we're here at St. Augustine, you should notice something about this when you look at this. Yes, first. Henry.
What?
You had a hand, I thought.
No.
Oh, you were just stretching.
I was blocking the sun.
Now there's an excuse. He was blocking the sun. All right, I'll take that for now. Yes.
It reminds me of Christ being crucified, and also Jews believed that the Messiah hadn't come yet, and he could have been the Messiah hanging on the gallows.
First of all, what is your notion of a concentration camp inmate, a boy, being hung on the gallows and being described as he?
On one hand, it's legitimate because as children of God, as God is our creator, God is within each and every one of us.
Anybody else want to comment? I know my time. Next passage. Okay. This is Wiesel talking. A young Wiesel surveys what is happening around him and says, "What are you, my God, compared to this afflicted crowd, proclaiming to you their faith, their anger, their revolt? What does your greatness mean, Lord of the universe?" Spelling error. "In the face of all this weakness, this decomposition, and this decay, why do you still trouble their sick minds, their crippled bodies? When Noah's generation displeased you, you brought down the flood. But these men here, whom you have betrayed, whom you have allowed to be tortured, butchered, gassed, burned, what do? They pray before you. They praise your name." Next before we comment. A defiant Wiesel yells out, "Why? But why should I bless him? In every fiber I rebelled, because he had thousands of children burned in his pits, because he kept 6 crematories working day and night on Sundays and feast days, because in his great might he created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, and so many factories of death. How could I say to him, 'Blessed art thou, eternal, Master of the universe, who chose us from among the races to be tortured day and night, to see our fathers, our mothers, our brothers end in the crematory? Praised be thy holy name, thou who hast chosen us to be butchered on thine altar.'" What does Wiesel say is the response of some people in the camp? What do they do in response to all this affliction? They do what? Anyone? Okay, over here.
I think what this shows is the difference between Wiesel's rational thinking, the reality of what's happening, and on the other hand, the magical thinking that people use in a psychological way to get them through something that is inexplicable. So we know today a lot of people deal with magical thinking, where we have to shift and say, what is the reality? What's going on? And it may have nothing to do with a God, whether you believe in him or her.
Anybody else want to comment? Either on what Lois said, because the first slide says, "These folks, in the face of all this, praise your name." And his comment in response as a young boy in Auschwitz is, "Are you kidding? Praise your name? Look what you have done." Look at that slide. Notice what he's accusing God of. Notice, take a good look at what he is saying. Back over here.
God is a God of love and goodness. Satan is the evil power. Satan did this. And God is being blamed by this quote.
Someone else? Don't be afraid. You want to know the guts? This is the guts. This is the guts of the issue. What Tony and I will both come back to in the end of this session is where the Christian view and the Jewish views overlap in terms of trying to understand, what do we make of this experience? What does this tell us? What does this tell us about who we are as people and the faiths we supposedly have? Hand over here.
God is good, but he has given us free will, and that was his mistake because men can be very evil.
Interesting comment. Lois wants to respond. Yes.
Well, maybe we are going to do away with free will in the future with AI, artificial intelligence. Is that what we want? And we have to believe that, well, I don't want to get into the magical thinking, okay? Because that's what I think we're talking about here. But without free will, without the will to make decisions for ourselves, we're artificial intelligence. We're going to be robots.
I personally don't think that people think anymore. They just follow. They do not think things over and understand the consequences, the ands and the ifs and the buts of what's happening. We have not taught our children to think. Well, I taught my children, they better think, or they're doomed. But we don't think. We don't teach our youth to think. And that's, well, you could see it in our culture now, today.
Okay, I'm going to stop this part. I'm going to go to Tony in a second, but if you could just look at the next slide. I'm going to close with this. This day I ceased to plead. I was no longer capable of lamentation. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes were open and I was alone, terribly alone in a world without God and without man, without love or mercy. I ceased to be anything but ashes. Yet I felt myself to be stronger than the Almighty, to whom my life had been tied for so long. If you read the book, he had gone to Jewish school. He had been trained in the Torah, in the Kabbalah. He knew he was an Orthodox Jew. He had been raised in a Hungarian home as an Orthodox Jew. And then it says the service ended with the Kaddish. Everyone recited the Kaddish over his parents, over his children, over his brothers, and over himself. I'm curious, okay? We have a diverse audience. I'm going to stop with this last slide. I'm going to go to Tony. How many of you know what Kaddish is? You're going to walk away today with some knowledge, as I hope you've seen from the last half hour. What is Kaddish? Everybody who's a Jew knows what Kaddish is. Everybody who's had a death knows what Kaddish is. And this was mass death. So Henry, explain to the folks who told us, what is Kaddish?
Kaddish is a prayer that a Jew recites for a loved one who has passed away. There's something called the Yortzeit. On each year, on the anniversary of a Jewish person's death, you go to the synagogue and you recite Kaddish to show that this person remains in your body, in your heart, in your mind, and in your soul.
And so, I leave with this part of our presentation, that in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all of it, in the midst of this mass murder, in this midst of this assembly line of death, carried out by people, I'll get to this later, who espoused faith also. Kaddish was still said. So I'll come back later, but that's the beginning of a very complicated subject, but one I tell you is worth your time. Read Night, and if you're interested, I'll give you other titles that deal with this subject, but start with Night. Start with Night. Okay, at this point, I'm going to switch over to Tony Acanelli, and he is going to, in his masterly way, deal with the subject of Christianity and the Holocaust, and then we'll come back together again after our break. Tony?
So, to jump right into the Christian aspect of this seminar, we look at the picture of Adolf Hitler and the question, the dogmatic question of Christianity, which deals with the concept of theodicy. And what is theodicy? Theodicy is the question that asks, why does an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God permit the manifestation of evil? And that's really, I think, kind of the key question here. If you look at the author Primo Levi in one of his most famous works, which is called The Drowned and the Saved, Levy's statement is this, and he says, there's a tendency, indeed the need, to separate good from evil, to be able to take sides, to emulate Christ's gesture on Judgment Day. Here the righteous, over there the reprobate. How then is it possible for Christians to reconcile the foundations of their faith with the atrocities perpetrated by their co-religionists during the Holocaust? Germany was a Christian nation. There were fewer than 500,000 Jews in Germany in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came to power as chancellor, and then within the next year as the dictator, the Führer. That's less than 1% of the German population that was actually Jewish at that time, right? The Holocaust was perpetrated by Christians against Jews. This says, by the extremity of the mass victimizations, Jews assume the role that Levy laid out of the righteous, while Christian persecutors became the reprobates. The necessity of reconciling this juxtaposition has haunted Christianity for 75 years. For those of us who are Christians to consider, while Christians, as Christians, were not the perpetrators of the Holocaust occurred in the most Christian part of the world. All Nazis had Christian parents, were baptized Christian, attended Christian churches, heard Christian sermons, went to Christian Sunday school, buried their relatives in Christian cemeteries. Furthermore, the Catholic Church never, to this day, excommunicated a single Nazi. When we look at what the church did or did not do, that's a fact that we need to reconcile. During the Nazi regime, Christianity and Christians failed in their own deepest beliefs, failed to help their neighbors, the weak, the lame, the blind. When tested, Christianity, with all too few exceptions, showed no love, no compassion, no forgiveness. This realization makes the Holocaust the most profound theological issue for Christians in post-Holocaust theology. If we accept the reality of what the church did or did not do, the key question now becomes, How do we rationalize that? How do we deal with that? How does Christianity handle that reality? In a post-war address to the College of Cardinals, the sitting Pope, Pius XII, at the time of the Holocaust, gave a strong defense of the 1933 Concordat that he negotiated with the Nazi government. Okay? This was the agreement in which the Catholic Church cuts a deal with the Nazi government and basically says, we as the Catholic Church will leave you alone if you promise to leave us alone. We will let you have the political stage. We will not be critical of Nazi philosophy, Nazi practice. In return, we ask that you leave us alone as Christians. And that's the Concordat in 33. Presents the church as a victim, as a survivor of the sorrowful passion which Nazi envy forced upon it. Portrays the church as a unified force of resistance. It makes the argument that the church did in fact resist the Nazis. To resist such attacks, millions of courageous Catholics, men and women, closed ranks around their bishops, whose valiant and severe pronouncements never failed to resound even in these last years of the war. That's the argument that Pius made to the College of Cardinals. Is it really what happened? This is something that maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're not. There was an article written in 1995 called What They Saw at the Holocaust Museum. And I want to just take a minute and read this to you. By the way, is anybody familiar with this? So the story goes that a Christian school, 7th and 8th graders, took a trip to the Holocaust Museum, and this particular writer who wrote the article interviews the Christian students, the young students, after they went through the museum. And basically wants to get their view on why they think the Holocaust occurred. What happened to the Jewish people in the Holocaust, and why do they believe it happened? And he interviews the students, and the students say, well, we think what happened to the Jews was maybe they didn't pray enough. Or maybe they didn't pray hard enough. Or maybe they didn't pray to the right God. But the thing that challenges his perspective the most is what the teacher had said. The teacher of the people, of the students that they had taken to the Holocaust Museum. And what the teacher said was, look, here's what I think happened. The Jews were God's chosen people. But the Jews failed to accept the Savior that God delivered to them. And as a result, this is probably why they became victims of this type of evil. And if they had simply accepted the Savior, they probably wouldn't have been victimized the way they had. And the point of the article is, maybe this teacher and these young students from this Christian school missed the whole point of the Holocaust Museum. And that their eyes were not opened at all by what they saw at the Holocaust Museum. It's something to contemplate. It's a great article if you read it. If you go home and Google what they saw at the Holocaust Museum, it's a really impactful article. 3 issues that we want to look at tonight for Christian theology. 1, how do we rid ourselves of anti-Semitism? 2, how do we speak of God now, after the Holocaust? And 3, how do we advance the relationship between Jews and Christians? And it's another interesting reality. Let me just get off the slides for a minute. And if some of you are maybe a little bit older than I, not much older, but a little bit older, you'll remember a prayer that was part of the Christian Good Friday Mass for a long period of time. And in fact, it was part of the Christian service on Good Friday until Vatican II, when Vatican II finally made an attempt or made an effort to maybe clean it up. And the prayer was called On the Perfidy of the Jews. And I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but during Good Friday service, there was a litany of prayers that are said, and one of them dealt with the idea of asking for forgiveness for the perfidy of the Jews. And that's not a word that we say very often. It's not a word you're real familiar with. But again, the argument was the Catholic Church praying that the Jews would have their eyes opened so that they could see the error of their ways in not recognizing the Savior, in not recognizing that Jesus Christ was sent to heal everyone, even the Jews, the blind and faithless Jews. And that was the wording of the prayer. All right? God Almighty, forgive the faithless Jews. And that was a prayer that was recited in Catholic churches around the world on Good Friday for a very long period of time, up until 1963. That was the position of the Catholic Church. So when we look at this concept, the church has to take a great deal of responsibility in the way it dealt with this issue and these issues. So let's see if we can go through. I see dinner has arrived, so we'll go another few minutes, and then we'll break for dinner. All right? So, the Christian Apology Tour is pretty interesting. Initially, the Stuttgart Declaration, we don't have to read the whole thing, promulgated by the Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany, all right, at the urging of Pastor Martin Niemöller. If that name is familiar to you, he is the author of the famous Holocaust poem, First They Came for the Jews. This is Niemöller. Through us, infinite wrong was brought over many peoples and countries. We did fight for long years in the name of Jesus Christ against the mentality that found its awful expression in Nazism. But we accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently. This is the first attempt by the Christian world. This is sticking its toe in the water a little bit to try to acknowledge that, no, the church did not do enough with regards to what was going on during the Holocaust. Nostra Aetate, in our time, Catholic, document that comes out of Vatican II, 1962 to 65, refutes the common teaching of the Roman Catholic Church at the time that the Jews were guilty of deicide for the death of Jesus Christ. Again, please understand, that was official Catholic Church teaching, that it was the Jews who killed Christ. And therefore, whatever happened to the Jews, they kind of deserved it. They kind of brought it on themselves. it shouldn't be very difficult to figure out how dangerous that mindset is. Rules out anti-Semitism for Christians. The Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, calls God's covenant with the Hebrew people eternal. This took until 1965 for the church to come around to that thinking. We remember a reflection on the Shoah, document published in 1998 by the church under the authority of John Paul II, condemns the Nazi genocide and calls for repentance from Catholics who had failed to intercede to stop it, urges Catholics to repent of past errors and infidelities and renew the awareness of the Hebrew roots of their faith. The New York Times criticizes this failure to address the silence of Pius XII, and the church has never really done that. Finding it regrettable that the Vatican has not yet found the courage to discard this defensive, incomplete depiction of Catholic inaction during the Holocaust. Papal visits to Auschwitz. You can see the different popes, John Paul, Benedict, and now Francis, okay, who have all journeyed to Auschwitz. It took a long time, but they've all made the journey. Finally. John Paul II's visit to Israel. This is a famous shot of John Paul II at the Wailing Wall at a time where he does, in fact, make the apology to the Jewish people on behalf of the Catholic Church. Now, again, he never really confronts the absolute inactivity of the Catholic Church during the Holocaust. But he does make a general apology. And for the church, which is a very conservative organization, it's a step. It may be too little, too late, but it's a step in the right direction. And then the impact on Christian theology, well, we'll come back to this because this is where we get into how the church kind of attempts to correct, at least philosophically, some of the wrongs committed by the church. And again, I would leave you with this idea. I think most of the wrongs by the Catholic Church are passive wrongs. They're not overt. It's a passivity that took place during that time period where there's so much more in retrospect that the church could have done. So maybe now is probably the right time to break. It's about 20 of. All right? You want to break? So folks, on the back table, maybe we should move them. Guys, do me a favor. Dom, do me a favor. Why don't you bring that stuff inside and put it on the table inside, and then we can eat at that point. get started on this second half of this. Hopefully everybody had enough to eat. Folks, there are, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 sandwiches left back there. If anybody's still hungry, please help yourself. If anybody wants to take them home, take them home. They're there. I think there's still water and some soda back there. If anybody wants anything, please help yourself to that. And let's see if we can get back on track here. So I put on the screen a picture, and the title says A Parable, and the parable is one that we're going to be everybody's going to be very familiar with, and it's the Good Samaritan parable. But this one has a slightly different twist. And this is written by, this twist was written by a gentleman by the name of Steve Smith, who was the director of the Holocaust Center in the UK. It's called the Beth Shalom Holocaust Memorial Center. And this is his spin on this. And rather than me try to butcher it by paraphrasing, I'm going to read it to you. It's very short. So it says, "There was once a man going about his business, trying to live out his life peacefully and without offense to those around him. One day, as he went about his life, a group of men set upon him. They robbed him, and they stripped him, and they left him on the side of the road for dead. Presently along came an educated, God-fearing, and good man, a man known for his generosity and charity. He saw the man who had been beaten and robbed, but he crossed over the road and carried on his way. Shortly along came a priest, a well-respected man of wisdom and of learning. Seeing his neighbor in distress, he too crossed over to the other side. After all, he would not be seen helping a Jew. And so the Jew lay in the gutter waiting for the Good Samaritan. But there was no Good Samaritan, not this time." It kind of establishes where we're at and what we're looking at here. And the overriding theme here is, how do you bridge this gap between what happened in the Holocaust and where we are today? How does it ever get any better? Do we really know each other any better than we did in 1945? In one of my classes today, we were talking about there was an article in the paper about the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue, which is 3 years ago now. Seems like yesterday, but it was 3 years ago, and the trial of the shooter is coming up, and so we used that as kind of a jumping off point for discussing the increase of anti-Semitism in the United States and then in Europe, and this parable kind of came to me because you think you've made so many strides and you're so far ahead of where you were 80 years ago, and yet you look at those situations and you wonder if you've really made any strides at all. So I thought the parable was a good way maybe to start this second part of what we're looking at. And realistically, what I wanted to kind of look at a little bit tonight, and I'm sure this is longer than we have, but I wanted to give you a couple of different attempts by Christian theologists, Christian thinkers, with regards to how they try to bridge this gap. All right, so if you don't mind, if we look at this, this is a Christian theologian by the name of Stephen Davis, and this is his approach at trying to understand what happened in the Holocaust. And it says, the traditional God of Christianity died in the Holocaust. This is the God is dead theory. It is no longer rationally possible to believe God is all-powerful and perfectly good. Now, to me, that's an interesting comment. That is no longer rationally possible, because it presupposes that it was ever rationally possible to understand that. You can think about that. In light of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, some Christian philosophers argue that Christians must give up themes that are offensive to Jews, including divine impassibility, Christology, and the notion of Christian evangelism. And we'll talk about some of those things, and it'll be a little bit clearer as we go. But this is obviously the most radical Christian attempt at Holocaust theology, that God is dead. And I'm sure Harry's going to touch on that when he gets back to the Jewish perspective on this, because I'm sure there's a school of thought that mirrors that. So we'll leave that for there. This is Wiesel. This is the story that Harry used, the gallows. And Wiesel, I guess, kind of throws out this idea of the suffering God. That God suffers with his people. Again, figure out how you want to deal with that. Because I don't know. This is probably a statement that is a little controversial, but it's okay. It's okay. I think sometimes we bend over backwards, or at least I do, and if this offends anyone, I apologize. I think sometimes we bend over backwards to let God off the hook. We rationalize. There was an argument, this lady made an argument, and it's a very, very normal argument that you hear all the time, that basically Satan is responsible for evil, God is responsible for the good aspects of things. And I'm going to say it, and it's fine. This is very personal, but our son, who's 31 years old, was just diagnosed with colon cancer. And we are practicing Catholics. We go to church every Sunday. We are, I obviously teach in a Catholic school. And at 31, that was the news we just got. And the response was, well, pray, and we'll pray for you, and groups will pray for you, et cetera, et cetera. And listen, it is completely well meant by everyone who says it. So please don't misunderstand the argument I'm making. But the conversation I had with Maria was, does it bother you at all that you're praying to the same individual who allowed this to happen? And I go, well, that's probably naive, because I don't think God is, if there is a God that I believe in, I don't think there's a God that says, well, he gets cancer and he doesn't, and his is stage 3 and his is stage 4. But it's a very difficult thing to deal with in your mind, and I'm sure we've all gotten mad at God at some point. If you still believe, at some point you've been angry, you didn't get a prayer answered, or he didn't save that individual, or he did allow that child to be born with a brain tumor, and you try to rationalize that in your head, and then we kind of twist ourselves into pretzels as far as how it happened and why it happened. And I'm probably getting way further off than I wanted to get, but I think all of that ties into what these people are attempting to do. They're attempting to take something that is completely irrational, which is the Holocaust and how it happened, and the evil that presents itself in that scenario, and then tries to make it work with an all-powerful, omniscient, omnipresent God. And I think that was what Davis was arguing. He's arguing the rationale doesn't work. It's not rational to be able to do that. And I think that's what he's saying. Wiesel's laying out the suffering God. That, okay, yes, there is suffering in the world, but when you suffer, I suffer. And, you know, listen, I guess that's a philosophy, and I guess it works. We'll have to see where this goes. Alice Eckert, the suffering of the final solution raises questions about God's goodness, excuse me, and his action in history. God cares for all his creatures, but has left the future in the hands of those he created. This is the free will doctrine, obviously, okay? And is indeed vulnerable and subject to being hurt and diminished. Rejects the concept of divine impassibility. Divine impassibility is simply the idea that God is perfect in every way, okay, and nothing bad that happens is attributable to God, okay? That's divine impassibility. When God suffers, the world shares that pain until it relieves the divine agony by relieving the agony of fellow human beings. So I actually like that last part that comes around. Basically, I think what Eckert is trying to give you here is this idea is you better be your own God in this situation. Because if you're waiting for lightning to strike, it's not happening. But I think she leaves open the possibility of a God acting within you to move you to be the answer to that issue. And to me, that's a little bit more optimistic than the God is dead reality. I think she leaves you an opening. Again, what we decide to do with this, I guess, is all very personal. But Jürgen Moltmann, after Auschwitz, divine impassibility replaced by a form of pantheism, God in this world and influenced by this world. That's very wordy. Involvement of God in the sufferings of Israel. This is really, probably should have been in Harry's presentation more than mine. But I like the quote at the end. In all their afflictions, God was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. I think he's saying basically the same thing Eckert just said. I think he's using a line, a quote, a statement from the Old Testament, and trying to bring it into Christian theology with regards to the Holocaust. And I think that's why he uses that line. Again, that's just my interpretation. Again, the suffering God. God participates in the suffering of men, and man is called to participate in the sufferings of God. For Christians, this is an interesting statement, I think. For Christians, the symbol of the agonizing God is the cross. And the fact that the cross has become a symbol of division between Christians and Jews is tragic. The reality to which the cross points is a Jewish reality as well, the reality of suffering and martyrdom. This is, I think you could probably spend 3 hours just breaking this philosophy down. I mean, this is how deep this stuff gets. But I love the second, bullet point there. For Christians, the symbol of the agonizing God is the cross, and the fact that the cross has become a symbol of division between Christians and Jews is tragic. But it's also accurate. All right? If you think about the hate groups that go after Jews, that go after the others in society, inevitably, they will wrap themselves in the cross, and that will become a symbol for them, okay? It's not an accident that the Klan wrapped itself in the cross. It's not an accident that the Nazis embraced Christianity, Martin Luther, and the cross. That was their symbol. And it's shorthand for those people need to go. And frequently it's used that way, yes.
I know that you used earlier the fear of God. Putting the fear of God into the people, to the Nazis or to their subjects, does that have anything to do with
a fear of God propelling them on to do what they did? See, I see it a different way. I see it as an absolute cover for what they wanted to do. I think the cover became very quickly non-Christian, enemy of the people, enemy of our culture, enemy of Germany, and therefore whatever happens is fine. Either we go to displacement and force them out, and if that doesn't work, we move on to the next step. But whatever it is, it's okay, because not only are they non-Christians, they are the murderers of Christ. That's the deicide charge. And it's so inevitably evil, but it does give Christians for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, from the Crusades. I mean, we were talking about the Crusades. I teach Arab history. We were talking about the Crusades in class the other day, and my guys were kind of shocked that Jews were massacred in the Crusades. Jews took I mean, the 2,000 died in the Rhineland massacre. I mean, it's just, they were as targeted as Muslims. And you don't tend to think of it that way, but guess what the symbol of the Crusades was? The cross. So it's a divisive symbol. And I think, listen, this guy's doing a nice job trying to bring that back together. I don't know. I don't know. Let's see. Paul Tillich, the God who is all-powerful does not exist. Man's freedom is a limitation. Somebody said that earlier tonight. I think it was you. Wasn't it you who said that was the mistake, was free will? Which is interesting, too, because you laid down the foundation that God made a mistake. And we don't always buy into that argument. Certainly not. That's not the Christian view. He doesn't make mistakes. Even the enormity of the Shoah is beyond his reach. That's a pretty gutsy statement by a Christian theologist. But it's also another attempt to let God off the hook. It's not his fault. I don't know. We should not ask, why does God permit suffering? Instead, we should recognize that there is that in the depth of our being which will enable us to challenge evil and to overcome suffering. And again, I think you see a pattern in some of these Christian theologists. It's always the argument like, hey, you're responsible for this. God gives you the ability to be the change agent, but you better pick up on that, because if you're waiting, it's not happening. And maybe listen, that might be the healthiest argument that I've heard in terms of the Christian view. Part of Jewish suffering and part of Jewish greatness is that the Jew has historically aligned himself with universal justice and has been the great opponent of evil. That's a pretty profound statement, I think, by a Christian theologist. I mean, that's a guy reaching down and saying, look at this group of people that we've been persecuting and murdering for centuries, and try to find out what you're missing here. That, to me, is what that says. Again, I could be wrong. This is really interesting. Traditional Christology, and Harry, I'm going to move real quick here. God's covenant with Judaism was abrogated with the appearance of Christ. This is the classic Christian Christology argument, okay? That the Jews forfeit the covenant when they reject Jesus. So, sorry guys, but you're out. You're no longer the chosen people. You forfeited that because you didn't accept the Messiah. The Jewish no to Jesus meant the end of God's involvement with Israel. God wrote you off. He wrote you off. Supersessionist theory. The church has replaced Israel. There is no longer any place for Israel in God's plan of salvation. Christians are the new chosen people. We got it right. We accepted Jesus. You guys didn't. You guys are out. Sorry. Christology. The new chosen people, the true spiritual Israel, now occupies center stage, assumes the rights and privileges of the nation that has been rejected. Not a particularly healthy philosophy for bridging the gap, I don't think. Faith and fratricide. Anti-Judaism is a necessary logical development out of the church's basic Christological confession that Jesus is Messiah. The Jews become the eternally damned ones, outside the pale of humanity, preserved until the end of time in a negative space of divine wrath and human misery. Okay? Once again, sorry, you had a shot, you didn't take it. Let's go right there, and then I'll end this. Because this is really fascinating to me, evangelical Christians. I have a really warped sense of interest, so I watch, and I get caught, she's laughing, I watch television preachers, and the one I watch the most is Jimmy Swaggart. Have you ever watched Jimmy Swaggart? And I watch them, and I do have a very bizarre sense of why I'm watching them. But this is their argument, and they love Israel more than Israel loves Israel. The evangelicals, they absolutely, and they raise a ton of money loving Israel, because their view obviously is that Jesus can't come back, okay, until we build the next temple. And who's going to build it? Well, we're going to raise money to build that temple and to keep Israel going, and then the rapture's coming, and we're out of here, and it's great. And it fascinates me. And listen, if you're an evangelical, God bless you. I'm sorry if I offended you if you're an evangelical, because I don't know any more than you do. But those guys, I love it. But evangelicals, they go nuts with this stuff. True Christians had nothing to do with the persecution of the Jews, and in fact went out of their way to protect Jews. The Holocaust is proof that all human beings need the gospel and need to accept Jesus as their Savior. Christian Zionism, the return of the Jews to the Holy Land, the creation of the state of Israel as a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ. So if you put these things together, which is really interesting, if you look at all these theories, there's the Christology theory that says, well, you guys are out, you're out, because you didn't accept the big guy when he came down. So you're out. However, if you want to come back in, all you got to do is build the temple again, and then you will magically find Jesus, so you'll be okay. You'll get in, okay? And then all the evangelicals can get raptured up, and it seems to work really nicely. So it's a nice way to kind of wrap all this up and say, even though you guys made a big mistake early on, you can still come back and salvage your reality. So you guys should feel good about that. All my Jewish friends in here, feel good about the fact that there's still a shot out there for you guys. All you got to do is join the team, and you're in. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. All right, listen, thanks. Thanks. Harry's going to do his thing, and then we'll wrap up. Thanks, bud. Sorry.
It's okay. Actually, what I'm going to do is just finish up what I'm going to say, and then we're going to have a few minutes together to talk with you. So we've got about 25 minutes. I'm going to take about maybe 10 to 15 or less, and then we'll go from there. So at this point, we have to switch. Yep. Okay, I will go to the next one. Okay. The way I left off with you was Wiesel as the accuser in Auschwitz. This was a phrase carved into a concentration camp cell by a Jewish prisoner. And it says, And if we had time, we would discuss this. For it says, if there is a God, he will have to beg my forgiveness. That would take us, if we were in a class, into a considerable discussion of how to deal with that. Because there's both ends of that in terms of the discussion coming from someone in a camp. But we'll defer that for now, and we'll come back to that later. Next line. On the other hand, and this is the reality that we're dealing in territory that none of us know, that none of us can say with any certainty. And yet the discussion is important. And the reality is that people came out of the same experience with very different points of view in terms of how to see what they had seen within a theological sense. And so, from the same experience, another would say, I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love even when I cannot feel it. I believe in God even when he is silent. You can take that as an affirmation of God, but it's an affirmation of God with a caveat. A silent God. Next. Just quickly. One of the first books I read in the late 60s, early 70s about this subject of theology and God, and I was ready for it, was a book by Richard Rubinstein. In 1966, this Jewish rabbi and scholar published a book called After Auschwitz that explored the meaning of the Holocaust for Judaism and faith. Rubinstein argues that the Holocaust smashes the traditional view of God as omnipotent or beneficent, and who safeguards Jews as the chosen people. So Rubinstein says in 66, and he's a rabbi and a Jewish scholar. And by the way, the author that you may know of, Michael Berenbaum, studied with him. And he says, traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in the historical drama. It has interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. I fail to see how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. Tony and I talked about that before. So God is not omnipotent. God is not beneficent. This runs cross to the traditional views that we have of God as neither all-powerful nor all-giving and all-generous. It challenges that traditional notion. And Rubinstein was attacked for taking this position as a Jewish scholar. Next. While asserting that a belief in a traditional God was no longer viable, Rubinstein, and here's the irony, never renounced his faith, went to Sabbath services every week. For Rubinstein, God left human beings to make their own moral choices. It is not God that gives meaning. Human beings have the opportunity to create meaning. For Rubinstein, this is our ballpark. It's not God's. God has nothing to do with it. He's not going to help you. He's not going to hurt you. he's going to be silent. But there is a God. He was often assailed as being a death of God advocate. Not really. It was more a God as a God on the sidelines. And so for him, he believed, but he believed within the restraints that he put. I must say, as an aside, that I understand that. I have to tell you that as a young person, I went through all the motions that my father and mother wanted me to go through. Like I said, at 4 years old, I was learning Hebrew with a tutor in Norman, New Jersey, that they sent me to. 4 years old. I went to a Jewish day school for a short period of time. I went to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvahed. I was raised to be a Jew. Because for my parents, there was nothing more important than for me, in the face of what they had experienced, to be a Jew. But I always wondered, and it became clearer to me as I got into my 20s, I wondered just how much my father believed. He was not Orthodox, but we never had pork in the house. I didn't eat a McDonald's hamburger until I think I was in my late teens. Never happened. Henry can understand that. But the bottom line, I always wondered about his faith. Yeah, he'd go to synagogue, but I really wondered how much of what he believed had been destroyed by what he had seen and what he had experienced, that perhaps he could not reconcile with the traditional notion of God. And yet, I was supposed to go to synagogue. He would come too sometimes. And I have to say, as I go forward, that I am a Jew. But when I go to synagogue, I'm not so sure who I'm talking to. It's a bit of the old joke, which I'm going to modify slightly. But it's an old joke that makes a point in the face of the Holocaust, which is there are two Jews, Stein and Schwartz, who go to synagogue every Saturday. You can't hear me? Two Jews, Stein and Schwartz, who go to synagogue every Saturday for many years. And Stein is somebody who listens closely, and Schwartz questions everything. One Saturday morning, a rabbi comes down from the bima, that's the pulpit, comes down and says to Stein, "Why do you come every week?" And Stein says, "I come to talk to God." The rabbi looks over to Schwartz and says, "Schwartz, why do you come every Saturday?" And Schwartz looks at the rabbi and says, "I come to talk to Stein." And I feel like that guy. Because the faith is important. But you know what? I'm not so sure the God part is always there. And it's possible to have one without the other. There's something to think about. Next line. That's the book, which I would recommend, by the way, for anyone who's interested. Next. Eliezer Berkovitz, very quickly, Orthodox rabbi, author of another book called Faith After the Holocaust. He said, each generation has its Auschwitz problem. Very interesting comment. The concept of Hester Panim, whereby God hides his face from those that are suffering. God must restrain and hide himself so humans can have freedom. Doctrine of Hastapanim. Human freedom results from divine restraint. If God were to prevent man from doing evil, then he would also prevent man from doing good. It's your ballpark. Berkowitz. Next. That's the book. Next. This is the famous philosopher Emil Fackenheim, who said, the Holocaust presents a new revelation from God. Jews must continue to maintain their faith in God and God's hand in history. Why? Because rejecting God would give a posthumous victory to Adolf Hitler. So we must maintain ourselves as a denial of Hitler. And it became the 613th commandment, not to renounce one's faith. Next. That's To Mend the World by Fackenheim. Next. This is Maybaum, who in a book called The Face of God After Auschwitz says, notice a lot of these books are in the 1960s. That by itself is interesting because for a period of time, people are sitting back. The suffering of Jews in the Holocaust was a vicarious atonement for the sins of the rest of the world. How's that for those who are Christian? Think about that one. Think about what that means. That these Jews, it's Maybaum, very different kind of thinking about that. Next. Sometimes the atheist looking out the window sees more of God than all who pray in the synagogue or church. Next. That's the book by Maybaum. Next. Just very quickly. A series of positions. God is dead. God was absent during the Holocaust. God is distant. He does not interfere. God is not omnipotent. No power to stop the Holocaust. God does not interfere intentionally to give man's freedom. God suffers with us as he did in the Holocaust. All different positions. Next. You may be shocked by number 7. The Holocaust was so horrible and so wicked, such that God should have prevented it. Perhaps God is capable of evil. That's David Blumenthal. Strong. God in the break. The Holocaust shows that God has broken his covenant with the Jewish people. Jews can hold on to Jewish law, but they do so voluntarily. Irving Greenberg. Next. Very quickly. Next. And yet, Elie was... And this is Elie Wiesel. With all that he said in the first part of my presentation, this is also Wiesel, who says, I have not lost faith in God. I have moments of anger and protest. Sometimes I've been closer to him for that reason. Next. Yes, where was God during the Holocaust? Next. Next. If there is a next. That's it. Okay. All right. That might be it. Okay. What time do we have? All right. All right. We're gonna take 10 minutes together now. Come on up. Come on up. All right. I think what we have, as you just saw, is that we have more in common in our presentations than differences. What we're both saying is that for Christians and Jews, after 1945, this was a moment of crisis. Crisis for Jews in terms of what Jewish people will believe about the God that was supposedly chose them as the chosen people, and for Christians who, from, I think, a legitimate perspective could be asserted, this was really a crisis of their own faith. Because when push came to shove, in the 12 years, in the years, certainly during the Holocaust, despite what people want to say, Christians were implicitly involved in what happened. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that there were those who went to church on Sunday and prayed to God, and Monday morning woke up and put gas should bring a crisis of faith in Christianity. And so both of us, from a lay perspective, understand our responsibility as educators to present this reality, as hard as it is for young people to think about and for all of us to think about. Because ultimately, thinking about that issue may make us a better people in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis.
We would like to spend the last 10 minutes. Would anybody like to say anything? Comment, question, yell at somebody? If you've been offended. Hang on. We're going to go right here.
I would like to say that, we think that after Hitler there was no more Holocaust, but there are more Holocaust and genocides going on right now from the time that we were through with Hitler until right now. It has never stopped, and it never will until we learn how to talk to each other, how to understand each other, how to embrace our differences, embrace our cultures, and learn that we're all one people, and the only thing that is different between us is how we celebrate our religions and what holidays we celebrate. And we need to find something that can help us break through this hatred and animosity to find that we are a better people. That's it.
Humans always have been very imperfect, and humans will always remain very imperfect. That sounds kind of hopeless. I'm sorry to have to say it, but it's what I believe. And also, Coach, you gave a personal testament about the heartbreak in your family. And if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you something that brought me to my knees to God within the last few years. I had mental problems. I sunk into a dark abyss. I had no way to get out. There was no light. And when I was on my knees, and I said, God, give me some light so I can crawl out of this darkness. The love of God wrapped around my heart and was incomprehensible to anything I ever knew before. So I am witness to tell you that God's love for his creation is incomprehensible to humans.
Thank you. As a child of survivors, I never knew my grandparents. I lost a sister that I never knew in concentration camp. But as I was growing up, both my parents, but especially my father, was a very, very religious Jew. Never once did I hear my mother or my father ever say, the Holocaust happened because God forsaken us. There is no God. Never. It was, going to synagogue on the holidays, keeping kosher. I was just raised always feeling that there's God and you have to obey God's commandments and God is good. Not once did they ever say to me, God let this happen, And to this day, I still feel very strongly in God because of the way I was raised by my parents. I guess I'll soul search for the rest of my life why this happened to our people, but I never abandoned God, and I feel strongly as today as I did on my bar mitzvah day about God. So, and I want to thank both of you. You did a fantastic, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Again, I'd just like to say thank you. I've been a public school teacher for 31 years, and I have taught a lot of historical fiction, nonfiction on this time period, but unfortunately I can't bring the God aspect in. So when I sat at lunch today and I was telling my colleagues where I was going after school today, they all wanted to come. They all wanted the information. They all wanted, I'm going to ask you for your PowerPoint and for yours. But my grandfather and great-grandfather came over from Czechoslovakia. And I remember when I first started learning about this time period, we always had Sunday dinner. And I said to my grandfather, I said, Pap, what were you thinking? Like, what was going on? What were you doing? And he says, well, I'd go to church and I'd pray. And I'd say, well, what did you pray for? And he said that the war would end and our soldiers would come home. And tonight, I mean, I'm a little embarrassed to say, Sue and I were talking, we never looked at it from the Christian side of it. We just looked at it as this pure evil that happened. And I know no matter what grade I teach, I always try and teach something. For those of you who have grandchildren, little children, there's a great book called Terrible Things by Eve Bunting. And it's, it's from the poem, First They Came for the Rat, It's a tremendous book. And just to bring that awareness, just to piggyback, we are all in this together. And I can't thank you enough for tonight. It really was a really powerful night, so thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering what role tradition and ritual play in one's ability to think about God. If you question God, that's so large a part of people's lives, either the religion itself or the traditions that go with it, that sometimes it seems to me that the ritual and the traditions are what carry people through, both Jews and Christians.
You think it overpowers the rest of it a little bit?
I think it could, and I think sometimes it becomes such a routine in one's life that one doesn't really think deeply on what it really should mean and how it should affect our actions.
And that was really, maybe I could just say this as kind of a closing. We took a little bit of a risk on this one, I think, and deliberately and knowing we were going to take a risk. And I teach here, I work here. This is a Catholic institution. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give my administration credit. I teach a Holocaust class here. We get into some very, very, very heavy stuff, including a real strong examination of the role of the church in the Holocaust. And I've been doing that for, 10, 15 years, whatever it's been, since we put the class in. Never has anyone ever tried to edit what is said in the classroom. No one has ever questioned an approach, a technique, where it goes. And I know that you can't do some of the things in a public school that you could do here. There was a famous case a year or so ago on a public school teacher who was let go because he approached the subject of denial. Well, we do denial every year. It's a part of, I don't know how you can understand the subject without talking about the denial movement and what that means. These folks have never, ever tried to edit that, and there's obviously some really, really heavy stuff that goes on there, so I want to thank them. But I think we did take a little bit of a risk here and possibly offended some people in here tonight. I hope that wasn't the case, but it may well have been. That was not the intention. The intention was to try to give you a look at how the two religions who have been so divided for so long have attempted to take easily the most significant action probably in the 20th century and then try to come together over that. And you can evaluate the success or failure of that attempt, but that's what we attempted to do. And I think we both knew it was going to be a little edgy, but hopefully it was something that stimulated at least some interest or some thought. So I want to, first of all, thank Harry. I want to thank Lois, the group, everybody that puts these things together, Sean, everybody. I know Harry says it all the time, it's a volunteer group. They do this really because of a love of the subject matter. And I want to thank our guys for allowing us to use the facility tonight. That was nice of them to do. They're very, very receptive to this organization and want to be as helpful as they can be whenever. So,
just a last comment. I want to thank Tony for everything he's done in terms of allowing us to be here, and for all the work that he's done over these years with regard to this particular subject. As Tony said, we have been doing this for a long time, and we will have more workshops and other presentations. Our next one is November the 4th. It will be a virtual presentation. You should look for it online. Dealing with Ernie Grunfeld, Dan Grunfeld. Look for it online. It's coming up. It's in a short time, but it'll be a presentation on a Friday afternoon. Look for it. Look at HolocaustCoalition.com if you want more information. We'll have other workshops and presentations in coming weeks. As you'll see, we are volunteers, but we believe in what we are doing from the various places from which we come to this particular group. If anybody wants to contribute as a volunteer organization to this, Margie's over there if you want to give her something or you want to send something in. And I'll leave you with one last thought, too, about the subject of faith, and we just didn't have enough time. This is just an introduction. I will tell you this, that I believe is probably true for Tony and myself. As teachers, he's still a teacher. I'm still at the university level too. But I'll say this about anybody who's in public education or private education, that we can't do what we do in an authentic way unless we have faith. If we didn't have faith in the task at hand, there would be no point in doing this. So you have to have faith in something. What that is up to you. Thank you all for your participation today. Thank you all for being part of this. Be safe on your way home, and take care, and I'll see you the next time.